It's brilliant to be able to talk about such an important issue. The question of human capital and investing in people, not just physical capital, couldn't be more important. And in most modern economies, investing in people is the answer to the productivity question. And this is certainly the case, as I learned speaking to the Chief Minister last night in Guernsey. My name, as Susie said, is John Cope, and I am Head of Education and Skills at the CBI, the Confederation of British Industry. The CBI represents about 190,000 businesses in the UK, many of which with a domestic or an international footprint, ranging right from micro businesses up to most of the FTSE 250. And education and skills, as you can imagine, is at the top of their agenda. It doesn't take very long, a conversation, and most of my job is spent talking to our members. It doesn't take very long in a conversation to get on to the question of how do we close skills gaps, how do we raise productivity, but just as importantly, how do we make a fairer, more prosperous society and actually make sure that every young person gets the right opportunity at the start of their life. So the question of human capital, as I said, is absolutely front of mind. And regardless of what happens on Brexit, building talent, ensuring young people get that right start will be issues still. And the fog of Brexit, hopefully, as it lifts, will actually allow us to get back onto domestic policy and talk about these issues much more. So, what is the UK perspective on human capital and the challenges post-Brexit? Well, to answer this question, I wanted to talk about four things today. First, the sort of the mega trends we've heard a lot just a moment ago from the OECD. Second, how the UK is doing to address those challenges. Third, some of the solutions actually that the CBI is working on with its members to try and help address those challenges. And fourth, and vitally, how business can step up. So first, there's the increasingly globalised economy. Guernsey is an amazing example of this, the interconnectedness, the power of that globalisation with businesses with a global footprint. But this means that competition is no longer with towns down the road or with even on the same country. Often competitors are now in other continents, in other parts of the world. And it also means that products are no longer as concrete or as tangible. They're more conceptual, more mobile, and more digital and innovative than ever before. And second, there's the demographic change. It's amazing to think that over the last century, for every 4 hours that passed, life expectancy increased by an hour. It's an astonishing statistic. But what that means is that most people today can expect an extra decade, maybe even 15, 20 years in careers. Most people will work that much longer than their parents. And that means the workplace itself is changing. And that's the third point. We hear a lot about automation and AI and machine learning. And we heard some earlier, just a moment, from the OECD. But I think most people haven't quite switched on to actually the pace of change. We often use phrases like the fourth industrial revolution, as if it's a new thing, as if digital is suddenly happening now. Well, actually, computers, digital, that happened in the 1960s, 70s, 80s, 90s. We're about 50 years in to the fourth industrial revolution. And actually, automation, AI, has been happening for decades. And only now are we really switching on enough to it. And I was struck by a speech of the CEO of IBM, Ginni Rometty, in January this year. She was talking about all the predictions about automation AI and how many jobs will be affected. And most of the predictions are around 10 to 30%. And her reaction to that, and it struck a chord with me, was that actually, why are we talking about what percentage are being affected? Why are we trying to put a number on it? Because actually, every job will be affected, 100%. Every single job will be affected in some way, mostly positive, but every job will be affected. So we should get away from trying to think of a percentage and actually try and equip everybody with those skills. And fourth and finally, the disadvantage gap. And what I mean by this is the gap between young people from a disadvantaged background and those from a non-disadvantaged background. Now, the definition of that is disputed and a debating point. But the best data we have is that, and this is not a unique problem to the UK, that disadvantage gap means that people from a disadvantaged background are 2 years, yes, 2 years behind at the age of 16. And that means that not only is it unfair, but actually it has a huge impact further down the line in the labour market. If disadvantaged young people are 2 years behind at the age of 16, they're very unlikely, almost impossibly, to catch up in their career and as an adult. That's lost entrepreneurs, that's lost inventors, that's lost business leaders. People falling behind at the start and never catching up. So these challenges together, deepening globalisation, shifting demography, increasing automation, and the disadvantage gap, they could all be incredible opportunities if we address them correctly. But opportunities can only be realised if they're prepared for. And that means investing in human capital. That means investing in young people. Because only education can prepare young people and adults for a world that's more dynamic, more fluid, more global, more competitive, and more demanding of human skills than ever before. And these aren't just qualifications. They are problem solving, creative thinking, the higher level skills that often only higher level education can provide. And we should keep that thought in mind, because amid all the Brexit fog, as I described earlier, last year the UK Prime Minister announced a major review of the entirety of post-18 education, something that's overdue, something that's never really done before. Finally, the UK at least is talking about academic, technical, apprenticeships, all these options on the same playing field together. So if those are the challenges, how can the UK and I think other countries compare? I spoke at the launch of a new report earlier this week. It was called Time to Action. It was published by the Learning and Work Institute, and it actually looked at a lot of data from the OECD. And its findings could be described, I suppose, as mixed at best. Their analysis found the UK is on track to fall or remain pretty stagnant in international league tables as in the run-up to 2030. And that includes falling, most likely, from 4th to 6th in the G7 on lower level skills, remaining stagnant on intermediate qualifications, and remaining 4th and stagnant on higher. So a mixed picture. And the OECD, with a snappily titled report, Future Ready Adult Learning Systems, that was launched last week, found that the UK was around average or below average on most indicators on how adults are prepared. So mixed and by no means negative, but it does raise the question, couldn't the UK be doing better? Couldn't it be investing more in its human capital? So if those are the challenges, and that's how the United Kingdom is doing compared to other countries, what should we do about it? What should the UK do about it? And learn from the best practice from around the world. I mean, first, it's important to accept that gone are the days that a teacher can train a young person, give them all the skills they need at the start of their career. So the emphasis today on lifelong learning and adult skills is important. But those broader skills that I spoke about, those creative thinking, broader skills like problem solving, teamwork, leadership, whatever, they are just as important and need to be looked at just as carefully. And I think we also need to start the conversation, and I'm sort of using a speech that I heard from Andreas Schleicher from the OECD, the Director of Education there. And it really resonated with me when he spoke about the debate in history about education, and this sort of circular debate where we often say, go back a few hundred years, does everybody need to go to primary school? And then we decided yes. And then we had the debate, does everyone need to go to secondary school? Does everyone need to go on to higher or further education? Does everyone need to go to university? And we keep having this debate as our economy demands higher and higher skills. So at the CBI, we're starting to ask that question. I will go on to this in a little bit more detail in a moment, about whether we need to start that debate now, about whether or not our education system needs to shift upwards to provide those higher skills. So, on to the proposals. The first proposal that the CBI is working on at the moment is actually about rethinking secondary education. It's right to ask, as the CBI's Director General did in a speech at the Royal Society last month, whether, to keep up with the modern world, we need to rethink our approach to secondary education, or GCSEs within the English Baccalaureate framework in the case of the UK, and whether that's the right fit anymore. In a world in which few employers ask for GCSE results and there are better ways of assessing schools, asking pupils to cram for a set of exams which feel increasingly archaic feels like a relic of an age when people left school in the UK at 16. So if we rethink GCSEs, if we reconsider that phase of education, could we not use the space in the school timetable to include more work experience, more social action, more of these employability skills that really prepare young people for the modern world? So broadening out secondary education feels to me and to many CBI members like a necessary question to start asking. But widening secondary education is not good enough if the options after it don't lead somewhere and lead on to higher level skills. And that brings me on to the second proposal about ending the neglect and sometimes snobbery towards technical education and apprenticeships. I feel like in the last 10 years or so there's been great progress on this, but more progress is needed. Too often, technical education, and in the words of the UK Education Secretary in a speech just before Christmas, is something that's seen as for other people's children. Too often that traditional route, that's sort of GCSEs, A-levels, a bachelor's degree, is the only mark of success. If you do anything else as a young person, you're seen as somehow coming second, not doing quite well enough. And there's all the cultural pressure, parental pressure, teacher expectation to push young people up that route. I think that's a mistake. I think it's a mistake that's an amazing option for many people, but there are loads of other options that are just as valuable and just as great routes to higher level skills. And I'm sure if I was to ask the question in this room, and I'm a hypocrite as much as a lot of policymakers, most of us here probably went to university. Most of us probably had some sort of university education. And too often, especially policymakers, and I do this all the time, we sit around in rooms talking about the importance of apprenticeships and technical education. And I always sit there just thinking, everyone around this table has a degree. No one actually has done technical education or understands the power of it. So we often have very warm words about technical education, but not enough action to really make sure that it's a strong option for all young people. And as a result, I think, especially, and some of you may have seen the debate that's going on in England at the moment around college funding, that colleges have been underestimated as a resource. They've been historically underfunded, politically neglected or forgotten, and frankly, post-Brexit, where education is a sort of rare, homegrown source of strength for England and the UK, we have to end that neglect, and we have to boost and end that snobbery. And that brings me to the third proposal, and that's actually about a new role for colleges. You know, the CBI has about 40 colleges in membership. We have a lot of education institutions, along with universities and schools and whatever. We're sort of a bit of a microcosm. So we are working with our education institutions to think about whether or not colleges could have a new role. Because that challenge I highlighted at the start around the ageing population, meaning that people are spending 10, 15 years longer in work, it begs that question of, if we're going to spend 15 years extra in work, should we not spend a bit longer in education at the start in order to prepare? And this is especially the case when, as we've heard, higher skills are more in demand than ever from business. So we've already accepted, as a country, as the UK, that people will stay in educational training till 18. This decision was taken in 2015. And our research, the CBI's research that Susie mentioned earlier through the Education and Skills Survey, found that actually employers are looking, about 80% of them, for those higher level skills in the coming years. So we've asked that question. Why do we stop at 18? Why is that now the middle, or sort of say the end of compulsory and the normal education for young people to have? Should there not be an entitlement? Not a compulsory expectation, but an entitlement to stay in longer, to go to level 4. Now, level 4 and level 5 is a sort of a wonkish term, I suppose, that doesn't make much sense because it doesn't really exist at the moment in the England system in most parts. Most people go to level 3, A-levels, and then they'll maybe jump to level 6, a bachelor's degree. But the question we're asking is whether or not actually a lot more young people should be encouraged to stay in education longer, beyond 18, for an extra year, maybe 2 years, and actually get to level 4, get to level 5. And this would mean, as I said, a few extra years potentially in education if a young person wanted to stay, and they would have that entitlement. And it could be a profound shift, a shift towards higher level skills and actually preparing people better than ever. And that's the role I described for colleges, I think. At the moment, colleges, especially in England, compete with or are outcompeted by schools beneath them because people don't want to transition necessarily into another institution from their secondary school, and they're outcompeted by universities above them. They lack often this niche in the system. So we're asking that question, is this the niche that colleges could have? That they could provide this level 4, this level 5 extra qualification below a degree for young people. So together, broadening out GCSEs, better technical options and apprenticeships, and starting that question about whether or not young people should have entitlement to stay in education longer, brought these together. And what you're really talking about here is a shifting of the education system upwards. The middle at the moment is GCSEs. That's the middle, that's the default expectation that everyone will get to. Well, we're asking the question, should that middle now move upwards? And there's actually an expectation that every young person will get to level 3, either technical, academic, or through an apprenticeship option, and then be encouraged and supported to go on to level 4 and stay in a little bit longer. And for those for whose it's right, will then be supported to go on to a bachelor's degree or perhaps a degree apprenticeship. And I have a final proposal. I've already said about how much business gains from education. So surely it's right for business to make its own contribution. Business cannot be a bystander in the society that sustains it. And everyone here today, and those that have sponsored today, demonstrate that business is willing to step up and can step up. In our Education Skills Survey, we asked the question to our members, and the survey ended up representing about 28,000 of our members. Are you willing to get involved in education? Are you willing to step up? And 80% said they were. 80% said they were enthusiastic about continuing to be involved in education or doing more in education. And yet when we asked the question, are you actually doing anything? That fell to 60%. So there's a gap. There's an enthusiasm of 80%, but only 60% of those that took part in our survey are actually doing anything. So I feel like the CBI has a role there as a broker, because if young people are to be given the work experience that I spoke about, that really prepared for the modern world, business has a role in making that happen. The statistics around that role of business are impressive. If a young person has 4 interactions with business during their education, they're 5 times less likely to be unemployed as an adult. It's an astonishing statistic, and it's the basis of the Gatsby benchmarks that are used in many schools, the benchmarks of what makes good careers advice. And there are several benchmarks, but one of them is those 4 interactions because of the profound effect it can have. So we need more of that. And I'm also proud of the role business has played in shaping the new T-levels, the technical levels that should be rolled out in England across 2022 and 2023. A rival, or should I say, not a rival particularly, but a strong option on technical education to go up against A-levels. Young people have that choice. And I know there's a huge amount of interest around the world actually watching T-levels in the UK to see how they are developed with business to try and create a real strong technical option at 16 to 18. And I'm also proud actually of the way business has worked with the government to make the apprenticeship levy work. In England and actually in the entirety of the UK, all businesses pay 0.5% of their payroll above 3 million into an apprenticeship levy pot. and that money is then used to start apprenticeships. Now, it's a difficult point, and it goes back to how we get business to step up, that the apprenticeship levy is an example of a policy that should support business. It makes them pay a levy and then support apprenticeships. But because of the way it's been set up, it's actually frustrated business. So it's an example of where policy designed to improve apprenticeships and technical education, because it hasn't been designed with business in mind, it hasn't worked as well as it could. So as I said, I'm proud of the CBI and all of our members working with government to try and make policies like the apprenticeship levy actually work in the real world. But as I said, business does a lot, but it's willing to do more. And I think, as I said, the CBI has a great role in this. Now, that role, I think, is closing that gap between the 60 and the 80% that I mentioned. Those are enthusiastic and those are actually doing something. And often the reasons why business can't step up is, as I said, not the lack of enthusiasm, but because actually education is quite impenetrable. I've tried my best in my comments here today not to use a sea of acronyms and jargon and words that mean nothing outside of the sort of education sector. But often for business, when they try to get involved with education through schools, colleges and universities, they're met with a very different culture, a very different language. So I feel like the CBI, with its microcosm of business and education and membership, can bridge that gap. And we are going to be working with our members to create a toolkit. Now, I need a better brand, because that sounds really naff and boring, but we are trying to create a toolkit of all the ways that business can get involved in education. I would love your suggestions to that, because actually there are some really developed areas where business has stepped up, careers advice, work experience, but there are a number of other areas where actually business can get more involved around curriculum design and curriculum delivery. Actually, a business leader going into a school, maybe taking a class to actually bring a subject to life, can be incredibly powerful. But also the shift in the way schools operate. They're bigger than ever before. Often they are like small businesses with huge footprints, huge amounts of staff. A lot of the issues they're facing are just business issues around executive pay or professional development of large workforces. So there's a role there for business to step up and actually really help schools. So in conclusion, let's get Brexit out of the way. Let's start to rethink and reconsider the role of GCSEs in the system. Let's end the neglect and snobbery of technical education. Let's consider that entitlement to a little bit longer in education if it works for young people. And finally, I hope I can work with everyone here, and we will work with all the rest of our members to actually try and bridge that gap between business and education. Thank you very much.